Hello. We're going to be looking at dungeons, specifically dungeon farming, dungeon agriculture, growing underground, why you might want to do it, how I do it, some tips and some of the things to expect if that's how you want to go about getting mandrake, barley, garlic, peppers, all the stuff you would want to grow for adventuring, crafting, that sort of stuff. So let's get started. Let's get some light on. I'm in a dungeon now. I'm in a 3x3 room. This is the room I tend to like for growing underground. The blueprint is cheap. You can get it off of any bookseller. I go to Owl's Head and get mine there. 550 granite to craft each room. Decent amount of granite in terms of dungeon rooms. I guess not as much as a lot of them. But you won't need that many. Each room can hold 280 plants. Is the number I use. It depends how you lay it out. But it gives you quite a bit of farming space for not all that much gold and granite and resources. So I'm going to start by laying some planters down inside this room here. We'll be able to fit quite a few of these planters in here. We'll be able to fit 14 of these large planting beds per room. But they fit pretty compactly, so we want to make sure to get them, pretty tightly packed together, which will also help us in watering and farming, as our cursor, our watering area circle, can cover multiple beds. One thing you do have to be careful about is you don't want to get them too close to the walls, because if we move this around, if we have this actually clip through this column, it becomes unusable. So you see this soil isn't lighting up green like it was before. If we put it back over here, it lights up green, we can plant in it, everything's good to go. If we put it here clipping through the column, if we're not careful, it won't light up green because it has that conflict with that collision there, and we can't plant it. So we're gonna place our first planter pretty carefully. It's pulled away from this wall here. It's pulled away from this wall. Everything lights up green. Everything's good to go. After that, we can actually fill out the room pretty quickly. Just the upper left corner of this new planting bed I'm placing. I just look for that corner to match up nicely with the corner of the bed we've already placed. If that matches up and lines up, everything else lines up, and I know it's good to go. You can see those lighting up green. It'll be plantable. Then I can just continue throughout the dungeon as I do that. These light up green, everything's good. This is one here. This is another potential problem. This column here, if we had clipped with that, we wouldn't be able to plant in it. But because we're lining everything up based on that first planter we placed, nice and neat, everything's still coming in being placed in a way that lets us farm it and get all the utility out of it that we hope for. Here, and then I'll go ahead and run back over here. Still using this first one I placed to kind of index the next one. It's nice and neat. I can carry on like that, and you can see pretty quickly you can set up an entire dungeon. But how big of a project is that? How much fits in a dungeon? Well, if you look down here at the deco bar, as I'm placing these, you see I have 800 objects right now placed out of 2,260 that I could fit in this dungeon. Each dungeon point you have lets you place 10 deco objects, and also lets you use 10 points on room. You get to use those separately. So if you have 100 dungeon points and you put 100 points worth of room inside, you're maxed out on your room allowance, but you can still place 1,000 objects inside of those rooms. Same with lights. I have 226 lights that I can place. If I place all 226 lights, those won't count as deco objects. I can place 226 lights and 2,260 deco objects in a dungeon where the rooms are using 226 dungeon points for rooms. You get to use them all together, simultaneously. So that seems like a lot of planters, 2,200, and that is a lot of planters. That's a ton of planters. But you can't actually place that many actual planters because each planter doesn't count as a deco object. Each slot within them does. So if I place this large planter, we were at 800 deco spots used. I place this large planter 10 by 2 planting spaces gives us 20 total. And now we've got to 820 out of 2,260 internal objects placed. So we'll be able to fit 2,200 plants in here, but not 2,200 planters. as nice as that might be. So as we carry on, you'll see that we can fit 14 total in this room of these large planters. If we wanted to, we could also do other planting styles in here. And just to confirm, we're at 861 deco spots used, 862, 863 because they're all single planters. And if we used, small planting beds that take up 4 plants, or that allow us to plant 4 plants, they would take up 4 deco spots. But we'll look at some other patterns for planters in just a bit here. We'll finish laying these out. This last one's kind of the trickiest because you have to have a place to hide as you place it. You see, we got a little bit sloppy there as we move around. But if we run across, we see everything's lighting up green for us. Nice big room full of plantable area. Now, I'm in night vision here. You can actually use night vision. You can use some other form of light. If you are going to do lights, I like the cobalt chandelier. It's kind of the cheapest one to craft. It doesn't hang down very low. It lights up a decent amount. 4 of these in a 3x3 room can be used to light up pretty much the entire room. Kind of place them towards the corner. Overall, I do like night vision. It makes it easier for me to see where plants are. The easiest is honestly night vision and these lights together, or night vision and the light spell together. But I actually don't typically bother with any lighting at all. I just use night vision. So if we were going to keep expanding this dungeon out, we could add more and more rooms. These 3x3 rooms that we use, you see we're at 36 dungeon points out of 226 used for room placement. If we go to place another one, it would go to 45 out of 226. So these use 9 dungeon points for room placement each. But since they hold 280 plants, if we use large planting beds, they consume 28 dungeon points worth of deco slots. So you'll never be in an area where you run out of dungeon points for rooms before you run out of dungeon points for putting plants in, if you're doing this kind of high density farming. And you actually can do even higher density farming if you use planting barrels or planting pots. You can actually place them starting in the corner. You do it tighter than that, and you can actually overlap them a bit. But you might have to use planting barrels. These planting pots might not do it. Oh, no, they do. So overlap them like this. You could actually get a higher density in this way. I really don't like this kind of farming. As you water or harvest or sow seeds, each planting vessel is propagated separately, and there's a small delay between it. When you are doing beds like this is one planting vessel. I'll call them 2 planting vessels, 3. They propagate separately, but very close together. When you have a large cursor spread over what you can see would be a very large number of plots, there's actually quite a delay as it propagates through, which can actually slow down the farming process overall. So it could be a lot faster to farm the larger beds. It's also not appreciably more expensive to lay them out. These rooms, again, are fairly cheap, and it takes so long to lay these individual planting pots out that I've never really seen the value of overlapping them with that. I always thought there's a bit of false economy there. But if it's a style you prefer, or if you're really concerned about packing in a high density, or you just think it's fun to have a really high density packed together, because with the propagation, if you're not using like chaotic feedback to farm very quickly, maybe that propagation delay actually isn't enough that it is slowing you down more than just walking around to more beds or something like that. That's always an option if it's something that's going to work out for you. And there's a lot of other options in how you lay out planting beds. The reason I go 7 wide is because I can water the width of 3 planting beds or harvest or sow seeds. That's because my harvesting skills, my planting skills are all about level 130. I can go 3 wide and take care of that batch there, and then I can turn around and do 3 wide and take care of the other half of the bed. So in 2 glyphs, 2 waterings, 2 harvestings, I can cover 3 beds, which means I could do these 3, then these 3, come down there. I can do 3 wide coming up here. Then I come down, I only have 2 left, and I can actually do 1, 2, 3 waterings in this instead of 4, and get down there and then just go straight to the next room. It's a very nice pattern for me, very nice flow. Before I had my levels that high, because it takes a considerable amount of crafting XP to get up there. You'll earn a lot of crafting XP from farming. In fact, a dungeon of this size for me, dungeon of this size for anyone, is going to get over 1 million crafting XP, producer XP, for the planting and harvesting of it. So you can get the XP from farming to get there eventually, but in the meantime, it is a lot. So I used to lay mine out like this. I used to go 12 per room, and again, that's going to be 260 plants per room. That's going to use the equivalent of 26 dungeon points. But the room is only taking 9, so we're still limited by the deco slots. We're not going to run out of slots and not be able to place room. But when my watering circle is only at 2.5 planters wide, this let me do 2.5 down, 2.5 widths down. Then when I went up, I would do 2.5 widths again, and that would mean that would put me here. You see on the right side of my cursor, my circle there. That's where I would be hitting. So I'd be able to. On my second pass would have done 2.5 wide, then 2.5 wide for 5 wide total. And then coming back down here, I had a choice. I could do 3 wide, but I would have to do a pass down and a pass back up for that other half. It was very awkward. So instead, I just left 2 wide, and I could finish 2 wide and have that same Z-shaped pattern. So I would come down, up, back down, and then just run to the next room. Down, up. Then if this planter bed over here wasn't there, I'd be able to do 2 wide, go back down. So that pattern worked better for me at the time. This was my first iteration of how I laid them out. This was my second. And actually, I tend to use a different one now. I still like this for stuff like mandrake. Very easy to farm, very quick. For things like cotton, barley, hops, grapes, these plants that are very tall and get in the way, it can actually be a little bit difficult to place your cursor each time in a way that's not going to leave plants kind of stuck, kind of orphaned, that you missed with your cursor. Just because those plants are so large, they get in the way. So I've actually started doing this instead in a lot of my dungeons. These are medium planting beds, so each one holds 10 plants. It's half as many as a large, but you can fit twice as many in a room. So there is enough space. If we start real close to the edge here, you see we come down here and we still do have room, even though it's a tighter fit, to fit 280 planting slots in. And what this lets me do is bring my circle out, and I can actually just place the corner of the circle. So if you look in the lower right of the screen, you can see that it's getting that corner. And then if you look in sort of the lower left, you can see it's also going to hit that corner. As long as it's hitting those 2 corners, and it's not like that where it's obviously very much off center. As long as I'm hitting those 2 corners, I know I hit all 3 of these planting beds completely, and I can water them or harvest them and then move immediately on. And since these are now clear, I have very clear sights here to place my circle and get all 3 of these planting beds together. So by doing this, I'm much more able to easily and quickly go through and harvest things like cotton and barley, hops, grapes, these things that tend to kind of get in the way when you're farming. So I do like this style. A little more work on the initial layout, but I have to place my cursor the same number of times. I have to do the same amount of walking. I get the same amount of yield. It's the same density. It's the same cost per planting space, and all these things. So I tend to prefer this layout these days. Now, another thing to consider when we're doing planting underground is the grow rate. All these planters, if you mouse over them, or actually it would take a plant. So if you plant a plant here and mouse over it, we'll be able to see it says growth rate times 0.1. That actually, that slows. That means the plant is growing at 1/10 the rate it would above ground. So if we look at our seed here, this is a hop seed. It says this seed can be harvested 2 days after planting outdoors without a greenhouse. To optimize harvest yields, every seed requires a first watering at the time of planting. A second watering can occur immediately after. The seed's third watering cycle begins 16 hours after planting, and the fourth begins 32 hours after planting. Okay, so if we plant this in a dungeon, we're going to get a tenth of that rate. That means it can't be harvested after 2 days. It'll actually take 20 full days, real-world days, for this plant to grow. That's a long time. That's 3 weeks basically to grow these plants. So it's a much slower rate. Has obvious downsides. It takes you much longer to grow what you need. It has an upside though, because if we look at those watering cycles, if we planted this above ground, we would have to log in at some time between 16 and 32 hours from the time we planted it to get that watering in, and then sometime between 32 hours and when it's mature, which is 48 hours, we would have to log in again and get another watering in. So we have to do a lot of watering with our game time, or it's entirely possible that we won't have that much game time, that maybe in 2 days we don't get to log in that many times. Maybe we only get to play a couple times a week. So by planting it in a dungeon, sure, you're getting less yield in one sense, but in another sense you're able to actually grow anything at all and get any yield out of it, because it's a much less demanding watering schedule. And that's actually why I prefer dungeon planting. I do play a lot. I do log in every day. I spend a considerable amount of time of most days farming. But there's days where I don't want to do it, or I might miss watering cycles, or I'd rather just go adventuring with friends and things like that. So the lax watering schedule of dungeon planting for me is quite nice. Go ahead and destroy this poor little plant here so we don't have a random uppity plant in the middle of our dungeon. And there's 1 day plants, there's 2 day plants, there's 3 day plants. This lovely guide here kind of lays them out. It breaks it down by greenhouse, which grows at twice the rate if you're doing it outdoors, and then the normal outdoors is shown here. It doesn't show dungeon times, but it's very easy just to add a 0 to all of these. 16 becomes 160. It's not very difficult math. And you can see some plants do take 24 hours between waterings outside. That's because they're 3 day plants. They take 3 full days to grow. That means underground they will take 30 days. They will take a full month to grow. Tea, apples, coconuts. But that could be good. Those could be useful crops. And again, if you want to be able to plant them and take a vacation before you have to water them again, it could actually be quite convenient to do them below ground. But that does mean this dungeon, this 2,280 planting space dungeon, is the equivalent of 228 above ground planting spaces, like half a village lot, a bit more than half a village lot's worth of planting spaces. If you are going to be diligent in farming all the time, and you want super high output, then that's not the strong point of dungeon farming, unless you have massive quantities of dungeon. Speaking of, let's go take. Speaking of massive quantities of dungeons, let's take a look at something that I find very useful, and one of the other things I really like about the slow pace of dungeon farming, and the more lax attitude it lets you take towards watering. So, as much as I do play, and as much as I like to optimize certain things, I don't want to water according to the schedule. It's not fun for me to have to track stuff to write down, when I planted stuff, when I have to water, make sure I hit the window. I don't find that particularly compelling gameplay. So I use what I call canary planters for dungeon farming. And instead of having a schedule that I water by, just every now and then I come to this house, and every one of these planters corresponds to a dungeon farm, a dungeon that's fully planted. And if I mouse over a plant, you'll see, if we have one that's not mature yet, which we do over here, water, you see growth rate is 0.1 again. It's growing at that slower rate because it's indoors. So since this grows at the same rate, as our dungeons, we can use these planters to indicate when we need to water our dungeons without having to go around, go downstairs, load into a zone, and check. Normally, you wouldn't have a dedicated house for this. Again, I do quite a bit of farming, so I do, but normally you would just put a planting pot in your, the entry to your house, someplace you're going to see it kind of on a daily basis, and you'll just notice, oh, this needs water, I better go water my dungeon. Saves you having to schedule or keep track or look down, so go down into the dungeon. So let's say we had just watered that dungeon we laid out, had just planted it and everything. What I would do is I would have a planting pot here. I would come here. I would immediately after planting the dungeon, I would plant one here, and of course I would have watered the dungeon when I right as I planted it. So come here, plant, water, and these are now on the same schedule. This is growing at the same rate. I've put the same seed in it, and so just once a day or whenever I think of it, I'll pop over here. Again, if this were in my normal everyday living house with a more sane number of plants, it would fit there. I would just walk by it every day and, okay, it's watered. I see it as I walk by. Then one day I would walk by and it's not watered. I know I could pop down to the dungeon sometimes in the next 160 hours in the case of this plant. So I have, days to do it. Pop down there and water it. So those canary planters, to me, are incredibly helpful.